Our topic is evidence for evolution, and a lot of the information that you're going to hear also can be found in Chapter 6, Section 2 of our books. So let's begin. So our goal, we only have one. By the time this section is over, I will be able to state evidence that supports the theory of evolution. And we're going to learn about 4 different pieces of evidence that supports the theory of evolution. The first one is finding of fossils. First off, notice it's in green because it matches the color that we used on our foldable when we made that. Fossils are the remains, an imprint, or a trace of a prehistoric organism. It's in red, so make sure that this gets highlighted in your journals. So sometimes remains would be like a bone. Imprint, that's what you can see in the picture down here. We have small fish that are imprinted in stone, the silhouette of their bodies, as well as the bones, or any other kind of trace could be a fossil remain as well. They're typically found in sedimentary rock. These are layers of sand, silt, clay, or mud that get compacted and cemented together through time. That's the definition of sedimentary rock, and you're going to be learning about that a lot more in earth science next year. But typically that's where these organisms are found, is in sedimentary rock. And then the definition of an index fossil, and this is something you're going to need to know for the upcoming activity. These are fossils that are associated with a specific time period. They can be used to date other fossils. For example, if you found, if you had the bone of a fossil, say, that was 60 million years old, and that fossil was typically only found 60 million years ago, 62 million years ago, 63 million years ago. So that fossil is associated with a specific time period. In this example, it would be about 62 million years ago. If you found another one that was above it in the earth, then you know that it's less than 62 million years old because it's on top, right? Younger rocks are on top. So index fossils are pretty useful because if you know a certain organism is only associated with a certain time period, and then you find other organisms either below it in the earth or above it, then you know it's either more or less than, in this case, 62 million years old. So here's some other pictures of some fossils. These are all imprints that are found in sedimentary rock. One way to determine a fossil's age is something called the law of superposition. This is where we have younger rock layers are on top of older. Makes sense, right? The younger rocks are on top because the older ones would get buried through time. So you're also going to need to know what this is for your upcoming activity. So write this down in your journal. It is in red. Make sure it gets highlighted. Keep in mind that the idea that younger rocks are on top of older to give an estimate of a fossil's age is really only an estimate. Here's a picture of a hillside that's been cut into. And let's pretend for a second that this layer right in here, is dated to be about 35 million years old. So, by the way, scientists have very, very accurate ways to date using radioactivity to date the age of rocks. So let's pretend that they know that this strip in here is around 35 million years old, that's how old that rock is. And that down here, the rock in this strip is about 50 million years old. That means if fossils were to find any kind of bone, scientists were able to find any kind of fossils or bones in this area, that they would know it would be between 35 million years old and 50 million years old. So that's really only an estimate. The second, notice number 2, and it's in blue, which corresponds to the blue that we used in our foldable. The second piece of evidence for evolution is body structures. Here we have the forearm of a human, a horse, a cat, a bat, a bird, and a whale. And we're also going to be doing an activity on this, on the forearm of some creatures. And they have them color-coded here to match. All of these dark brown bones right here are very similar. Even though they have different shapes, they have a similar purpose in all of these very different organisms. This light color, yellowish color here, also have, even though they're different shapes, they all have a similar purpose for all of these organisms. Then there's a lighter brown, which is found in each of them. And then there's a whitish color, which is also found in each of them. You can see them here, white, white, white. And all of these have a similar purpose. So the idea then is if you have similar body structures in organisms that are very different, well, how did that happen? Well, obviously, everything about us is controlled by our genetics and the genes that were passed on from parents. But if you can go back in time far enough, there must be some kind of an ancestor back there that's been passing on these genes throughout the years that says these different animals, very, very different, are going to be receiving genes that give them these bones that are very similar in their purpose and in where they're found in the forearm. And these are the forearms of every single one of these organisms. So they're called homologous structures. It's in red. Make sure it's highlighted. These are similar structures that related species have inherited. And the idea is that, we already know that we get our genes from inheritance from parents, but you go back through time, there must have been some kind of common ancestor back there, maybe perhaps millions of years ago, passing on genes throughout the years. And then, of course, animals change. We've already established that. And so through time, if you have enough time, in this case millions of years, you get very different organisms: human, horse, cat, bat, bird, and whale. Body structure definition is the basic body plan. This is also in red. Make sure it gets highlighted, please. And let's quickly look at the evolution of the whale. This is about the Paleocene era, 65 million years ago. And there was this one creature that actually lived on land. And then somewhere around 55 million years ago, you can see that it's starting to, this animal has started to change somewhat. Changes a little bit more, changes a little bit more, changes a little bit more. And this blue line here represents the cutoff between being a land mammal and a water-dwelling mammal. And that happened, if you follow this up, that happened about 45 million years ago, maybe 44 million years ago, 43. Looks like this is about 37. And you get the idea here. To today, this is today's whale. And so you can see with these small baby steps, even though they are small baby steps, that took them millions of years to go from each baby step to the next. But the idea is that this one is born, right? Many organisms are born. They're born with a variety of traits, and you can look at the different traits that you can see here, the physical traits that you can see. And the babies are just a little bit different. Well, as the environment changes, some of those babies with some of the traits are better suited than others, and so those are the ones that get favored. They're the ones that get to live, grow up, and reproduce and pass on those favorable genes. And so if that keeps happening through time, this is what you end up with. And so the idea is that from here all the way to today took about close to 60 million years, as you can see. The third piece of evidence is embryology, which is the study of the early development of organisms. Please write that down as a vocab word and highlight it in red. I know you can't see this very well, but I'll just tell you, this is a picture of the early development of fish, salamander, turtle, bird, mammal, and humans. And we're actually talking about very early development. These little organisms here are only inches long, and so we're talking about the first week or two of life. And so in the very early development, you can see that there's a lot of similarities between these very different organisms. Well, okay, in why do these organisms look the way they do? Well, the answer is always the same. It's because of the genes that they inherited from their parents. So does that mean all of their genes are the same? Well, not necessarily, because you know that a turtle is very different from a mammal, which is different from a bird, which is different from a human, different from a fish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so as these organisms grow, you can see they start to differentiate. They start to change. The fish is taking on the shape of a fish, salamander, turtle, and the bird and the mammal and the human still look relatively close to one another. But you can see that there are these are gills actually right here. Gills, gills, gills. All of them in very early development have gills, and then they lose their gills, okay, which makes sense. We don't have gills anymore, but the fish and salamanders do. They will continue to develop that through time. And this is the later stages of embryology, which would be the study of the early development of these organisms. So, in this one, it definitely is starting to take the shape of a human as well. So, the question is that why do they all start out the same very early in life, looking the same? Well, it's because of their genes. Well, where do you get our genes from? Well, mom and dad. And so and if you keep going back generation after generation for millions of years, the idea is that there's a common ancestor out there somewhere that's been passing on genes through time, but we ended up with very different organisms, these 6 very different organisms. Why? Because as the common ancestor reproduced, organisms were born, variety of traits, some of them are a little different from one another. I mean, you know the story, right? The story of natural selection. So the study of embryology then supports that as well. So scientists make good conclusions about evolutionary relationships by comparing the early development of different organisms. So the conclusion then about these evolutionary relationships is that, there's got to be some explanation here for why, lots of organisms start out looking very, very similar in their physical characteristics very early in life. And the idea is that there is a common ancestor. Similarity suggests these animals share a common ancestor. And then DNA. DNA is an orange, which corresponds to the orange in our fossil. DNA is an abbreviation for a big fancy word called deoxyribonucleic acid. Short for, this is the molecule that carries our genes. And DNA is made up of protein, a bunch of proteins in a certain sequence, kind of like a code. And depending on how the code is written, that will give an organism the characteristics that they have. So what scientists do, they compare DNA from living organisms to determine how closely related they are. So obviously it's no surprise to find out that the DNA of, say, a horse and a dog are a lot more similar than a horse and a fish. You get the idea, right? So, and if you look at the code that's written on the DNA molecule, it makes sense. And again, something like, a pig and a bear are a lot more similar than a pig and an insect. So, and when I mean more similar, not only in looks, but also similar with their code that's written, the DNA code. And this is just a picture. I know it's kind of hard to see, but you can see all these letters, A, T, G, G, T, T, G, A. Those stand for the names of proteins. And this is the code. And so scientists can look at inside the cell, the nucleus of a cell. They can look at the chromosomes that carry the DNA. And DNA, of course, is made up of protein written in a code. So this tells what protein, the sequence of the proteins are. And then this, of course, translates into a certain type of characteristic. Here's another one, too. These names over here are Latin names of critters. And you can see C, T, A, G, A, T, C. These are all letters that stand for the names of proteins. And so this one here and the second one, for example, are pretty similar until we get to this protein, and then they differ by A and C. This one's got an A, whereas these don't have any for that trait. And then, so we've got some similarities. But by comparing all of these, you can see scientists will look for how many differences there are. And the more different they are, it actually translates into more difference in their physical characteristics as well. So, how did these organisms get their DNA? Well, from mom and dad. The story is always the same. It's inherited. Well, how did these codes end up being inherited? Why was there only one difference between these two, and two differences between these two organisms, or three differences? And then if you look at the critters themselves, you see that they look very, toads and frogs look very similar to one another. And lo and behold, they have very, very similar code that's written as well. So why is that? Well, the idea is that, there was some common ancestor that was toad-like and that was frog-like, many moons ago, right? Many million years ago or so, or even thousands, that have been passing on genes. And then slowly but surely through time, the genetic makeup can change. We saw that in that one movie we watched on the mice with the mutations. And if they change, then the organism looks a little bit different through time. And do they have good genes? Well, if they got good genes, they're going to be well suited to the environment. And if not, they're not going to be as well favored, and they may not live as long. I mean, you know the story, right? It's been the same for a long time now. So the DNA also suggests then that there's a common ancestry. The more closely related the genes are, the more scientists believe that there was a common ancestor millions of years ago that was passing on these genes, and then as organisms were born, there were slight differences. Proteins similar to ours are also found in primates. This does not mean that humans evolved from monkeys. It doesn't say that at all. The idea, though, is that there might be a common ancestor way back millions of years ago that was passing down a code, a DNA code, that might have changed through time, and if it changed, then we started going more towards being human-like. And if it changed in another direction, then perhaps that animal changed to become more chimpanzee-like. So common ancestor, perhaps. The primates, the code in primates, the DNA code in primates is very, very similar to the DNA code in humans. So that's the idea. Those are the 4 pieces of evidence for evolution. And so now let's get to some activities.